Sarah believed that her life was a blessing, even on the most difficult days. Every day at 5 a.m., she prepared lunch for her husband, Jake, and opened her small artisan cafe before sunrise in Portland. Customers loved her organic blueberry muffins and the way she greeted each person with a genuine smile that brightened even the rainiest Oregon mornings. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Jake would wave to her through the cafe window, wearing his designer shirts and flashing the charming smile that had won her over 9 years ago. People thought he was a supportive and present husband. But inside the cozy apartment above the cafe, the reality was quite different. Jake hadn't been able to hold down a steady job for 3 years. He always blamed the economy, claimed that the jobs were below his level, or insisted that he was waiting for the right opportunity. Sarah didn't mind working 16 hours a day, but lately she wondered when Jake had stopped looking at her the way he did when they were newlyweds. One rainy October morning, Sarah stood at the window, watching the traffic slowly pass by on the wet street. Jake walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, his cell phone glued to his hand as usual. "Good morning, honey," Sarah said, setting his coffee on the table. "You're up early today." He mumbled something incomprehensible, scrolling through Instagram. Sarah smiled, trying to ignore his cold tone. "We have a big order for Mrs. Patterson's birthday today. I need your help at the cafe after lunch, if you're free." Jake didn't even look up. "I might have other plans. Steve said he wants to talk business. Don't wait for me." Sarah's smile faded. She drank her tea in silence, watching Jake finish his coffee, leave his dirty cup on the table, and walk out without even saying "see you later." Sarah was driving back from the ingredient distributor, humming along with the radio, her mind already at the cafe thinking about the day's orders. She never saw the truck coming. There was a sudden screech of brakes, then total darkness. When she woke up, the strong smell of disinfectant filled her nostrils. The constant beeping of machines echoed in her ears. Her body felt heavy, her legs completely numb. A nurse leaned over her with a worried expression. "Sarah, you're awake. Can you hear me?" Sarah tried to move her legs. Nothing happened. Panic washed over her like a cold wave. "Where's my husband?" she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "He's outside. I'll get him." A few minutes later, Jake entered the room. He looked pale and anxious, but his face softened when he saw her awake. "You gave me a terrible fright," he said, forcing a nervous smile. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "You've been in a serious accident. The doctors said your spine was injured. They don't know if you'll ever walk again." Sarah's hands shook uncontrollably. "I can't feel my legs." Jake reached out to her, but Sarah noticed how he hesitated. His fingers were cold when they finally touched hers. "We'll get through this together," Sarah said, more to herself than to him. Jake nodded, but his eyes drifted to the cell phone vibrating insistently in his pocket. Even at that moment, he couldn't give her his full attention. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain, physical therapy, and endless medical paperwork. Sarah's coffee shop had to close temporarily. The bills came in like a relentless avalanche. Insurance barely covered the basics, and with each passing day, Jake became more distant and irritable. He stopped sleeping in the same bed, claiming that Sarah's moans of pain during the night prevented him from resting. He started coming home later and later, always with some excuse ready. Sarah felt the chasm between them growing, but she didn't know how to bridge it. If you're wondering how a love that seemed so solid could crumble so quickly in the face of adversity, subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen will reveal the true character of everyone involved in this story, and show that sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we trust the most. Jake began to show his true colors just 3 weeks after the accident. Sarah was doing physical therapy at home, desperately struggling to regain some movement in her legs, when she noticed subtle but disturbing changes in her husband's behavior. First, there were the whispered phone calls. Jake would go out into the hallway or the bathroom every time his cell phone rang, speaking in a low voice as if he were hiding something important. When Sarah asked who it was, he always gave vague answers: work, Steve about that deal, or simply no one important. Then came the delays. Jake started leaving in the morning without explaining where he was going and only returning in the late afternoon, smelling of expensive women's perfume, a perfume that was definitely not Sarah's. When confronted, he would get angry and say he was trying to get a job or sorting out practical matters related to medical bills. Sarah tried to be understanding. She knew the situation was difficult for both of them, that Jake was also suffering seeing her in that state. But as the days passed, her patience was wearing thin. One night, Sarah woke up thirsty and realized Jake wasn't in bed. It was almost 2 a.m. She dragged herself to her wheelchair and went to look for him around the house, thinking maybe he was watching TV on the couch or working on his laptop. That's when she heard his voice coming from the kitchen, whispering on the phone, "She's asleep." "No, Madison, I can't keep pretending everything's fine. She's not the woman I married anymore." Sarah felt her world collapse. Madison was her best friend since college, the maid of honor at their wedding, the person who always said Jake and Sarah were the perfect couple. The person who had visited Sarah in the hospital every day for the first week, bringing flowers and words of comfort. "I know it's complicated, baby," Jake continued, using a tone of voice Sarah hadn't heard in months. "But I can't spend the rest of my life taking care of someone who, can't be a real wife anymore." Sarah held back a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Her tears fell silently as she listened to the man who promised to love her in sickness and in health plan how to abandon her with her own best friend. "I need to wait a few more weeks," Jake whispered. "I can't look like the villain by leaving now. But soon I'll file for divorce, and then we can be together without hiding." Sarah returned to the bedroom silently and pretended to be asleep when Jake came back to bed an hour later. She spent the rest of the night awake, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The next morning, Madison showed up for a support visit, as she had been doing regularly. She brought Sarah's favorite muffins from an expensive bakery downtown and spoke in that sweet, concerned voice she always used. "How are you feeling today, dear? Jake said you've been having some difficult nights." Sarah looked at Madison's face with new eyes, noticing details she had previously ignored: the perfect lipstick, the flawless makeup even for a casual visit, the expensive perfume that was exactly the same as the scent Sarah had smelled on Jake's clothes. "I'm fine," Sarah lied, testing her suspicion. "Jake has been so loving. I don't know what I would do without him." Madison quickly looked away. "He's a special man. You're lucky." "I am," Sarah said, watching Madison squirm uncomfortably. Not many men would stand by their wife in a situation like this. It's true," Madison stammered, nervously twirling her hair. "Some men couldn't handle, with so much responsibility." Sarah felt nauseous. Her own best friend was sitting there, eating her muffins, drinking her coffee, expressing false concern while planning to steal her husband behind her back. That afternoon, after Madison left, Sarah confronted Jake directly. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." Jake looked nervous. "What is it? Are you and Madison having an affair?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jake didn't deny it right away, which was already an answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and defensive. "Sarah, you're being paranoid. Madison is our friend." "That's not a denial, Jake." He sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Look, this is a difficult situation for all of us. You've changed, I've changed, things aren't the way they used to be." "So it's true." Jake stared at her with an expression that was a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Do you really want to have this conversation right now? Do you think I chose this situation? That I dreamed of becoming a full-time nurse?" Sarah felt as if she had been slapped. "A nurse? Is that how you see taking care of your wife?" "Sarah, be realistic. You can't walk, you can barely leave the house, the cafe went out of business. What's left of our marriage?" His words cut deeper than any physical pain she had felt. Sarah realized she didn't really know the man she had married, or maybe he had always been this way, and she had been too blind to see it. That night, Jake packed his bags and left the house without explanation. Sarah was left alone in the dark apartment, listening to the rain beat against the window, realizing that she had lost not only the use of her legs, but also the two most important people in her life. What she didn't know was that very same week, a letter was being drafted at a law firm in Seattle, a letter that would completely change the course of her story and prove that sometimes the universe has a very particular way of delivering justice. Sarah spent 2 whole weeks crying. Not just because of the paralysis in her legs, but because of the brutal discovery that the two most important people in her life had betrayed her in the most cowardly way possible. Jake didn't get in touch, and Madison stopped pretending to care after it became clear that Sarah knew everything. Medical bills piled up on the kitchen table like a mountain of paper that grew every day. The owner of the building where the cafe was located had sent 3 eviction notices. Sarah calculated that she had enough money for another month's rent, maybe 2 if she cut back on food. It was at that moment of total despair that the letter arrived. The envelope was elegant, with the letterhead of a Seattle law firm, Morrison, Fields and Associates. Sarah stared at it for several minutes before she had the courage to open it, imagining it was another bill or some legal matter related to the accident. "Dear Ms. Parker," the letter said in formal handwriting, "we regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle Benjamin Parker. As stated in his will, you have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate. We request that you contact our office as soon as possible." Sarah read the letter 3 times before she could fully process the words. Benjamin Parker. She barely remembered him, a quiet, mysterious man who showed up at family gatherings when she was a child, always wearing expensive suits and saying very little. Her mother used to say that Uncle Benjamin had made his fortune in Seattle, but they never went into details. At first, Sarah tossed the letter aside. The last thing she needed was more complicated paperwork or false hope about an inheritance that probably consisted of some old furniture and maybe a small amount of cash. But the next morning, when her landlord showed up demanding the overdue rent with increasingly explicit threats of eviction, Sarah picked up the letter again. She had nothing left to lose. The call to the law firm changed her life forever. "Miss Parker," the secretary said in a kind voice, "we've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your great-uncle left very specific instructions on how to find you. May I ask, how much is the inheritance?" Sarah hesitated, expecting to hear a few $1,000s, maybe enough to pay the most urgent medical bills. "The total inheritance is approximately $500 million. Sarah was silent for so long that the secretary asked if she was still on the line. "I'm sorry, I think I misheard you. Did you say 500,000? "No, ma'am. 500 million. Your great-uncle was the founder of Parker Technologies, one of the first software companies on the West Coast. He sold the company for a fortune in the 1990s and invested the money very wisely." Sarah had to hold on to her wheelchair to keep from fainting. It was impossible. People like her didn't inherit $500 million. That only happened in movies. "However," the secretary continued, "there are some conditions set forth in the will. Your great-uncle specified that the inheritance must remain completely confidential for 6 months. During that time, you will receive a monthly allowance for basic expenses, but you cannot reveal the existence of the inheritance to anyone. After 6 months, the full amount will be released." "Why the secrecy?" asked Sarah, still processing the impossible information. "Your Uncle Benjamin wrote an explanatory letter that will be delivered along with the documents. But basically, he wanted to protect you from people with bad intentions who might try to take advantage of your new financial situation." 2 weeks later, Sarah was sitting in an elegant room at the Morrison, Fields and Associates office, signing papers that made her a multimillionaire heiress. The lawyer, Mr. Morrison, a gray-haired man with a fatherly expression, handed her Benjamin's personal letter. "Dear Sarah," the letter began in the shaky handwriting of an elderly man. "If you are reading this, it means that I am no longer in this world and that you are probably going through a difficult time. I always knew you had a special heart, even when you were just a child. I saw how you cared for injured animals, how you shared your toys with less fortunate children, how you always chose kindness even when no one was looking." The letter went on to explain that Benjamin had spent years watching Sarah from afar, proud of how she had grown into a hard-working and generous woman. He had made the letter a secret because, in his own words, money reveals the true character of the people around us. You need time to find out who really cares about you, and who only cares about your bank account. In the months that followed, Sarah lived a kind of surreal double life. Outwardly, she was a divorced woman in a wheelchair, struggling to pay her basic bills with the help of social assistants. But secretly, she had access to virtually unlimited financial resources. With her monthly allowance, a modest amount but enough for her basic needs, Sarah was able to keep her apartment, buy physical therapy equipment, and even start a small online business selling her famous muffins for delivery. She discreetly hired Oliver Chun, a young graphic designer who had been a regular customer at the cafe, to help her create a sales website. Oliver didn't know about the inheritance. He just thought Sarah had taken out a small loan to start over. "You're amazing, Sarah," Oliver said one afternoon as he helped her pack orders. "After everything you've been through, you still find the strength to rebuild your life. Sarah smiled, watching Oliver's skilled hands carefully organize the products. Unlike Jake, Oliver never treated her like a broken or incapable person. To him, the wheelchair was just a detail, not a definition of who she was. Meanwhile, through social media and mutual acquaintances, Sarah learned that Jake and Madison were living together in her apartment, but things weren't going well. Jake was still unemployed, Madison was struggling to pay the bills on her own, and the two were constantly fighting about money. Sarah could have felt satisfaction at their difficulties, but she discovered that she had developed something much more powerful than a desire for revenge. She had developed inner peace. For the first time in years, she didn't depend on anyone else for her happiness or emotional stability. What Jake and Madison didn't know was that Sarah was using her months of secrecy not only to heal emotionally, but to plan something much bigger. She had 6 months to decide how to use a $500 million fortune, and she had begun to come up with ideas that went far beyond simply living comfortably. There were only 2 weeks left in the quiet period when Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would definitively test whether she had truly moved on from the past. The call Sarah received on a Tuesday afternoon almost made her laugh out loud at the irony. It was Jake with that forced casual voice she knew so well, the same one he used when he wanted something important but pretended it was nothing. "Hi, Sarah. How are you?" he asked, as if he hadn't abandoned her in a wheelchair 5 months ago. "I'm fine, Jake. What do you want?" "Come on, I can't call just to see how you are. We're adults, we can be civilized." Sarah almost laughed. Jake had never been civilized for a single day during their marriage, but now, out of nowhere, he was discovering courtesy. Something was going on. "Jake, you haven't called me in 5 months. Get to the point." He hesitated, and Sarah could picture him running his hand through his hair, that nervous tick he always had when he was lying. "Well, it's just. I heard you're doing well. That you managed to reopen some kind of business. I'm happy for you." Ah, so that was it. Someone had mentioned Sarah's growing online business, and Jake was sniffing opportunity. His hypocrisy was so predictable it was pathetic. "Who told you that?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how the information had reached him. "Madison heard from someone that you're selling your sweets online and doing really well. We're happy for you." Sarah felt a twinge of sadistic amusement. So Jake and Madison were still together, and apparently things weren't going as well as they'd hoped. If they were investigating her finances, it was because they needed money. "How nice of Madison to worry about me," Sarah said, unable to hide her sarcasm. Jake didn't seem to catch the irony. "Look, Sarah, I know things ended badly between us. But you know I never meant to hurt you. It was a complicated situation." "Complicated." Sarah repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. That's an interesting way to describe cheating on your paraplegic wife with her best friend. The awkward silence that followed was music to Sarah's ears. "I deserved that," Jake said finally, trying to sound humble. "I was an idiot. A coward. Madison and I. It didn't work out. We broke up 2 weeks ago." "Interesting." Sarah made a mental note. Jake was only calling because things with Madison had soured. Typical of him to look for a safety net when his plans failed. "I'm sorry," Sarah lied. "I'm sure it's been hard for both of you." "It has been. And that's not all," Jake paused dramatically. "I'm going through a rough patch financially. You know how tough the job market is." There was the real reason for the call. Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from laughing out loud. "That's too bad, Jake. But I don't understand what that has to do with me." "Well, I thought, since you're doing well with your business, maybe we could talk about a reconciliation. Not romantic, of course," he hastened to clarify, "but a partnership. I could help you expand the business. I've always been good with numbers and marketing." Jake's audacity was impressive. Sarah was genuinely speechless for a few seconds, processing the level of narcissism required to abandon a wife in a wheelchair, cheat on her with her best friend, and then come back asking for a partnership when he needed money. "Are you suggesting we go back to working together?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Exactly. Look, I know I made mistakes. But we always had good professional chemistry. Remember how well we worked together at the cafe?" Sarah remembered perfectly, her working 16 hours a day while Jake slept late and complained about his responsibilities. "And what would you offer in this partnership?" she asked. Jake perked up, clearly thinking he was winning Sarah over. My management experience, my contacts, my total dedication to the project. We could start small, just to test the waters. Jake, Sarah interrupted him, can I ask you an honest question? Sure. Do you really think I'm stupid? The silence that followed was delicious. What do you mean? You abandoned me at my most vulnerable, betrayed our wedding vows, got involved with my best friend, and now 5 months later, you call here thinking you can come back because you need money. And you have the nerve to call it a partnership. Sarah, it's not like that. It is exactly like that, Jake. And you know what the most pathetic part is? You don't even have the creativity to come up with a decent excuse. I've always been good with numbers. You couldn't add 2 plus 2 during the 3 years you were unemployed. Jake started to get nervous. Look, there's no need to be hostile. I'm trying to be mature here. Mature would have been standing by your wife when she needed you. Mature would have been honoring the vows you made. What you're doing right now isn't maturity, Jake. It's desperation. That's when Madison entered the story. Sarah heard a female voice in the background, then Jake whispering furiously, "She's not taking it." Jake, Sarah said, put Madison on speakerphone. Since you two are planning this together, let's have a civil conversation between adults. After an awkward pause, Madison's voice emerged from the phone, trying to sound casual. Hi, Sarah. How are you? I'm great, Madison. Better than I've been in years, actually. That's good. Look, about this whole thing. I know we made mistakes. Mistakes? Sarah savored the word. That's a delicate way of describing the two of you planning behind my back while I was in the hospital. Madison swallowed audibly. Sarah, it wasn't like that. It was all very confusing, very emotional. For the two of you, maybe. For me it was crystal clear. I found out that my husband and my best friend were horrible people I didn't really know. Jake came back on the line, clearly irritated. Listen here, Sarah. You don't have to be so bitter. We all make mistakes. You're not perfect either. And that was the moment Sarah decided it was time for Jake and Madison to learn a lesson they would never forget. You're right, Jake. I made a terrible mistake. Jake seemed surprised by the apparent change in tone. What mistake? I wasted 5 months thinking that you two had left me with nothing. 5 months feeling abandoned and betrayed. 5 months thinking I had lost everything. Sarah. But you know what I discovered in those 5 months, Jake? I discovered that I'm much stronger than I ever imagined. I discovered that I can rebuild my life without toxic people around me. And I discovered, Sarah paused dramatically, that I inherited $500 million from my great-uncle Benjamin. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could practically hear Jake and Madison's brains processing the information. You what? Jake stammered. $500 million, Jake. Did you know that Uncle Benjamin was the founder of Parker Technologies? He left it all to me. With one interesting condition. I had to keep it a secret for 6 months to find out who really cared about me, and who only cared about the money. Madison was the first to find her voice. Sarah, that's amazing. What wonderful news. The instant change in Madison's tone was so obvious it was comical. Isn't it? Sarah said. And you know what's really interesting? The 6 months are up next week. For 6 months, I watched to see who showed up to support me when they thought I had nothing, and who disappeared when they thought I was a burden. Jake tried to sound enthusiastic. Sarah, that's fantastic. I knew things would work out for you. And look, about that partnership. Oh, now you really want the partnership, Jake? I always did. It's just that I didn't know how to help before, but now. Now that you know I have $500 million. The awkward silence returned. Jake Madison, Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of finality they had never heard before. During these 6 months, I've discovered something wonderful about myself. I don't need people who only want me when it's convenient. I have incredible plans for this money, plans that will help a lot of people who really need it. But you two are definitely not part of those plans. Sarah, wait, Jake began desperately. No, Jake. You had your chance to be in my life when I needed you. You chose to leave. Now that I have the resources to build something extraordinary, I'm going to do it with people who deserve to be by my side." Sarah hung up the phone and immediately put it on silent. Over the next few minutes, she received 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, alternating between desperate attempts at reconciliation and veiled threats about lawsuits and marital rights. But Sarah didn't see any of them. She was too busy planning how to use her inheritance to create something Jake and Madison could never destroy, a future built on a solid foundation of character, integrity, and for the first time in a long time, complete emotional independence. 18 months after the phone call that changed everything, Sarah Parker was standing, yes, standing, on the main stage of the Portland Convention Center, addressing an audience of over 2,000 people at the first National Symposium on Inclusion and Entrepreneurship. The doctors had been wrong about her paralysis being permanent. With access to the best treatments in the world and a determination that Jake had never been able to completely break, Sarah had regained partial movement in her legs. She still needed support to walk long distances, but those first hesitant steps on stage were the most significant of her life. 2 years ago, she said into the microphone, her voice echoing clearly throughout the auditorium, I was a divorced woman in a wheelchair, abandoned by my husband and betrayed by my best friend at the most vulnerable time of my life. Today, I am CEO of the Parker Foundation, an organization that has invested $200 million in inclusion programs for people with disabilities and entrepreneurs in vulnerable situations. The audience erupted in applause, but Sarah continued with that wry smile that had become her trademark. But this is not a story about how money solves all problems. This is a story about discovering who you really are when everyone you loved shows you who they really are. In the first few months after inheriting her fortune, Sarah had turned her pain into purpose with an efficiency that impressed even the most experienced financial advisors. The Parker Foundation was not just a charity, it was a social transformation machine that ran with the precision of a multinational corporation. She had purchased the building where her old cafe had been located and turned it into Portland's first fully accessible professional training center. The facility offered free courses in entrepreneurship, technology, and professional skills, with a special focus on people with disabilities, women in vulnerable situations, and young people from marginalized communities. Oliver Chun, who had started out as a freelance designer helping Sarah with a muffin website, was now the foundation's chief technology officer and in the last 6 months, had also become something much more significant in her personal life. Sarah, Oliver had said one afternoon as they reviewed the foundation's quarterly reports, can I ask you a personal question? Sure. Have you ever wondered what your life would be like if Jake hadn't abandoned you? Sarah thought for a moment, watching the students at the training center leave their evening classes through the office window. Honestly, I'd be an unhappy woman married to a man who didn't respect me, working 16 hours a day to support someone who saw me as a maid, not a partner. Maybe Jake gave me the greatest gift of my life when he left. Oliver smiled. And Madison? Madison taught me that some people are only friends when it's convenient. It was an expensive lesson, but a necessary one. Speaking of Jake and Madison, their lives had taken predictable and not particularly inspiring turns. Jake had tried to sue Sarah for marital rights to the inheritance, but quickly discovered that expensive lawyers don't work for free, and that courts aren't particularly sympathetic to men who abandon disabled wives and then try to claim rights to fortunes they didn't even know existed. Madison had tried a different approach, starting a blog about forgiveness and reconciliation, where she publicly shared her journey of personal growth after making mistakes in her friendship with Sarah. The blog had exactly 47 followers, most of whom were fake accounts she had created herself. But the real poetic justice wasn't in their failure, it was in the extraordinary success Sarah had built. The Parker Foundation had become a case study in business schools on how to use wealth to create lasting social impact. In less than 2 years, the organization had created 15 training centers in 12 states, all fully accessible and offering free programs to more than 8,000 people annually. Established a $50 million microcredit fund specifically for women entrepreneurs with disabilities. Developed innovative assistive technologies that had been made available free of charge to nonprofit organizations around the world. Created more than 2,000 direct jobs and influenced inclusive public policies in 6 states. But perhaps Sarah's most personal project was the Second Chance program, an initiative that offered comprehensive support to people who had been abandoned by their spouses during health crises. The program included free legal counseling, psychological support, professional training, and when necessary, financial assistance to rebuild their lives. You know, Sarah said during her speech at the symposium, what I learned about betrayal is not that it destroys you. It reveals. It reveals who really cares about you, who is by your side only when it's convenient, and more importantly, it reveals what kind of person you choose to be when you're at rock bottom. In the audience, Sarah could see representatives from foundations, business leaders, disability rights activists, and hundreds of beneficiaries of Parker Foundation programs. But her eyes searched and found Oliver in the front row, smiling with that genuine pride Jake had never shown even in the best moments of their marriage. Jake abandoned me because I became inconvenient, Sarah continued. Madison betrayed me because she thought I had nothing left to offer. But they were wrong about one fundamental thing. They thought my value was in my legs or my ability to work 16 hours a day serving other people. They never understood that my true value lay in my ability to rebuild myself, to learn, to grow, and to use my experiences to help others do the same. After the event, Sarah and Oliver had dinner at a small, cozy restaurant, the kind of place Jake would never have gone to because it didn't impress anyone important. Oliver held her hand across the table. "Can I confess something?" he said. "Always. I fell in love with you long before I knew about the inheritance. In fact, I fell in love with you when you were still selling muffins online and pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't." Sarah smiled. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" "Because you were healing. And because I wanted to make sure you knew I wasn't interested in your money." "And now?" Oliver laughed. "Now I know you're a woman who built a charitable empire, who regained the use of her legs through sheer determination, and who still makes the best blueberry muffins in Oregon. The money is just a bonus." 6 months later, Sarah and Oliver were married in a simple ceremony in the garden of the Foundation's first training center. Instead of wedding gifts, they asked for donations to the Second Chance program. They raised $2.3 million. Jake and Madison weren't invited, obviously. In fact, Sarah had stopped thinking about them altogether, which was, in itself, the greatest victory possible. The real lesson of Sarah's story isn't about inheriting money or getting revenge on people who hurt you. It's about discovering that your inner strength is worth far more than any relationship based on convenience or self-interest. Sarah learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually redirections in disguise. Jake abandoning her wasn't a loss. It was a liberation from a marriage that had been diminishing her for years. Madison betraying her wasn't a tragedy. It was a lesson in choosing better people to trust. Most importantly, Sarah discovered that when you stop defining your worth by what other people think of you, it becomes impossible for anyone to truly abandon you. Because you already have everything you need within yourself. Today, as the Parker Foundation continues to grow and impact thousands of lives, Sarah knows she has built something that transcends any individual relationship. She has created a legacy based on purpose, not on people who may leave when life gets tough. If this story has touched you in any way, if you've ever been abandoned by someone who promised to stand by you through sickness and health, subscribe to the channel and share your own story of overcoming adversity in the comments. Because the greatest revenge against those who underestimated you is not proving them wrong, it's building a life so extraordinary that their opinion becomes completely irrelevant.